Okay, so I'm going to respond to the Kyle Korver article that he wrote recently about the experiences that happened in Utah and the white privilege that he talks about. And just to give you my background, I'm originally from Salt Lake City, actually Cottonwood Heights, Utah. Parents still live there, lots of family there and friends. And there's just a surprising number of people that still don't understand what he's really talking about, even after it so clearly affected their community and was so clearly displayed in front of the community. And I think it's simply because if you don't know, if you've never experienced racism, you'd have no idea what it is. If you've never left Utah, you've never experienced racism. And if you're white and you've never left Utah, you've never experienced racism. You've likely never seen it because it's not likely to happen if you're around 95% white people. And you have to understand something about the different types of racism that there are. Now, before I continue, let me give you some background. I was married to a very beautiful and very strong-headed Nigerian, second-generation Nigerian woman that has been an enlightening source of observation in this matter. And it took about 10 years for me to even notice the simplest things. So I'm going to share with you a story that happened with her and her family in Utah that really, really started to put the icing on the cake for me and started to understand what it is that they're talking about and why white people in Utah don't understand what it is. Because you have to experience it firsthand before you really start to understand. And before I tell this story, I'm going to define what I call privilege. And I define privilege as something that doesn't seem like that isn't a problem for you, because privilege is defined as something that's not a problem because it's not a problem for you. In other words, you don't see why people are so upset about it because you've never experienced it yourself. That's privilege. If you grow up in a rich family, you don't understand why people have student loan debt and why it's such a big problem. That's a privilege that you have. You could understand, you could sympathize with people and say, man, that would suck to have that much money in debt, but you don't know what that really feels like because you're not dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. And in a lot of ways, a student debt crisis, you can use that to understand racism, because if you have $100,000 in student debt, you're not to just wake up one day and then it be gone. It's going to be there whether you want it to be there or not. But if you're someone who doesn't have student debt and you are, thinking about what it might be like to have student debt, you could sit within that for an hour, 2 hours, a day, 2 days, 10. You could really sit down with it and really, really try to be in that space and try to feel what that might feel like and feel the empathy. But at the end of the day, you can open your eyes, awake from that dream state that you were in when you were thinking about it, and poof, the debt is gone. You don't actually have it anymore. And that's what it's like being black in a mostly white community. There are maybe 90% of the time, you're not feeling that. You're not feeling any racism. You're not feeling any xenophobia. You're not feeling anything. But 5% of the time you will. And what happens in that moment is that you realize that you're not. It doesn't just go away. You can't wake up and now all of a sudden you're not black anymore, or you're not a big sore thumb in a big white community, but you're clearly sticking out. It doesn't go away, no matter how much you think about it. So you understand how that's a similar thing. Obviously, racism and student debt are very, very different in terms of, the effect that they can have on people. But you understand how you can sympathize with what it might feel like to feel racism, but at the end of the day, you walk into the store and no one's going to follow you around because they think you're going to steal things. It's because you're white. Whereas we can sit around all day and talk on a table and walk away from that table, and the table we were talking about racism, that racism, that issue doesn't follow you out of the room like it does with a black person or with a Mexican person or with any minority person. They take that conversation with them and they go to sleep with it and they wake up with it the next morning and then they live their entire lives with it. So you have to understand that it doesn't just go away because you think it doesn't exist, okay? It happens every time, every day. Now, the second thing I want you to understand is when I first started dating Valerie, my wife, she would always tell me, see, those people are staring at me. And I'd say, no, it's just because you're pretty. They're not staring at you. And she's like, whatever. She knew I didn't understand, and I didn't. Until one day we were in Rome, Italy, and I literally saw a man who was on the phone. He walked by us, and he dropped his call, and he stared at Valerie like he couldn't even believe she was standing there. And there's no reason why he did that. It was nothing like a, oh, she's so pretty. It was like a, whoa, what is that? Okay? And that was like that was on our honeymoon. And that was like the first moment where I'm like, that was weird. Okay. All right. And then I started noticing it. And it doesn't happen all the time. It's not, most of the time it's honestly kind of agnostic. It's just kind of, well, that person's just kind of staring at you. And they're not being, and that's not malicious, but it is like a, you know, it's like, okay, what, and then one instance of that is not a big deal. 2 instances, 10 instances, but thousands of times over your lifetime, in moments that you didn't expect or want it, in places that you didn't expect or want it, at times when it shouldn't have happened, and it takes you by surprise, and you're like, oh, now I have to deal with this. Now I feel like people are watching me. It becomes death by 1,000 cuts, and it just slowly degrades you and degrades you and degrades you. But I want you to really stop and think about what it must be like for that. And then remember what I said earlier. Thank God that you don't have to do that that you can walk away from that thought whenever you want. You have to understand this, okay? So what is it that white people in Utah are not understanding about Kyle Korver's article? They're not understanding that they don't have to live it every day. They're not understanding that the privilege that they have is that it's not affecting them. And that's that they don't get it. It's naive. It's naivete. Okay, so let me share with you something that happened at actually a parade in Utah that I think will help illustrate what it must be like to feel like a minority in a mostly white community. Okay, so I was with Val's family. We went to the Draper Days parade, and it was me and the rest of her family, and so I was the only white guy in the group. And I love her family, and we get along so well. It was her mom and her sister and her nephews and nieces. And what became very obvious, first of all, was we were the only black family around. And okay, that doesn't really matter, by itself, right? But what started to happen was this. And this is the kind of death by 1,000 cuts that gets so annoying. When they came around and they started throwing out the candy, you could tell that, for most of the parade, we were at the very end of the parade, for the most of the parade, they were just blindly throwing out candy. Just by the time they get to the end, they're just like bored. They're just throwing it out. They don't even care. But literally, they turn around and they see us, the only black family there. Obviously, I'm not a black person, but I was with them. And immediately it's just like, oh, something different, something unique, something novel. And they just threw candy at us like crazy. I mean, we had piles of candy, more so than anybody else. And you might think, well, that's good, that's awesome. They're throwing candy at you. Why are you complaining about that? And I'm not complaining, I'm just letting you know that obviously we were a sore thumb. Obviously, they hadn't seen a black family the entire time. Obviously, they wanted, And in some ways it's a really weird emotion, because it's like they were trying to include us, right? They're like, yay, diversity, cool, a black family, you know, they wanted us to like feel like included. And it's like that came from a place of like, you know, sincere want to include people. But it came across as like I was saying, like, ooh, novelty, pattern interrupt, interesting. See, and then there was even another interaction that really drove it home, where they, you know, people hand out flyers and they try to promote their businesses. So there was a dance studio there that was saying, hey, you know, love to you know, have you guys come to our dance studio. And they're handing out dance studio, and this girl, we saw her handing out flyers and, you know, handing out to different families. She gets to our family, total demeanor change. Okay, complete obvious demeanor change. She's not being sincere. She starts saying stuff like how she likes hip hop, and how, you know, hey, I'm cool like this, you know, you want to come play, you know, do hip hop dance, and, you know, yo, and stuff, like using that kind of language. Didn't use it at all with anybody else. Treated us differently. And again, it came from a desire to try to include us and try to like connect with us. Like, I do believe it came from a sincere like place. But it comes across as you obviously treating that person differently, and it's an unconscious bias. It is an unconscious bias. And so you can sense that. It can be sensed that you're not being sincere, that you're not being sincere. And it was just so obvious. And so I'm lucky enough that, you know, had I walked away from that situation, I would have just blended into the crowd, and I would have no longer felt like a sore thumb, you know, hypothetically, right? But you're there, I'm there with them, you know, they can't just walk away. They can't just walk up the street and avoid those situations. The entire rest of the parade is like that. And you have to put yourself in that spot in every single situation in your life. Okay, in elementary school, getting picked at the playground, okay, thinking that you're good at basketball because you're black, so you get picked first, right? At the school dance, right? People not sure, you know, if you're gonna ask them out because they're black or something, right? Maybe that's nothing to worry about, but those things start to add up, right? Sending out your resumes. Are they gonna worry about the fact that I'm black? I still have no idea what that feels like, but I'm telling you that this is a real thing, because I've seen it firsthand, and you guys don't understand. If you're white and you live in Utah, you don't understand. And it only took about 5 minutes of perusing through the Facebook comments that the Utah Jazz posted, and they talked about Kyle Korver's article, that it became obvious. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't get it. You've never experienced racism. And I don't think you're a racist, but you are naive. You're completely unexperienced. You don't know what you're talking about. So humble yourself and shut up and listen.